Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, Blueberry shows, just like search pests and vassals, journalists, gonzo journalists, Hunter S. Thompson fans. I'm a useful idiot. Today I want to talk about media bias. And this is something I've been thinking about recently for a couple reasons. One was coming across comments recently on different YouTube, other videos, and people still out there championing Fox News or championing CNBC or whatever. And still with the cable and the mainstream news, and the fact that people still put any credence into those outlets, but also just the distortions of their views. One commenter actually suggesting that Fox News was more accurate and didn't mess with the truth as much as all the other media outlets. And the other story that came out recently that was rather surprising is the fact that 50% of Americans still get their news from television. So that's pretty disappointing overall. But we shouldn't be surprised. So let's talk about media bias, because it's everywhere. Everyone's aware of it. And I'm actually going to quote a lot from an article by Frederick Allen called Balancing Act. And he said it so well that I'm just going to quote some of his statements and then mix it in with some guidelines about media bias. So here's Mr. Frederick Allen's opening statement. Quote, "That's the problem with media bias. We all know it's there, and we all know we need to see it, detect it, and overcome it if we're ever going to know the truth. We also see it in different places. All too often we think whoever we agree with the most is the most unbiased. It's the other guy, the one we disagree with, who holds the biased opinion. How then are we ever to get at the truth we need not only to know what is going on, but to be responsible citizens in a democracy, or as I like to say, republic," unquote. So that's the basic premise, and I totally agree with that. I've often said in comments to other YouTubers, just because you agree with it doesn't mean it's not propaganda. That's something to take very seriously. And today it can be even harder than ever to know what to believe, who's telling the truth, what is the product of what agenda, what is the extreme bias, or what is downright lying. And and it's gotten more complex because we have so many different mediums now. And certainly the internet has a lot of complexities because all sides are represented now. But this is a very important topic because an engaged citizen is obligated to fact check, to try and find the truth and try and find out what the realities are, because otherwise you cannot interact with the state in a responsible way as an informed citizen. And our founding fathers certainly knew that we needed to have an educated electorate. And unfortunately, we know we do not have an educated electorate. The society is commercialized and people vote on name brand recognition and jingoistic sloganeering. So politics is just another form of advertising. And even just realizing that can help you with media bias. And let's also remember that the government never really changes policies. It only hires a new public relations firm and starts a new campaign. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And we also live in an era when everybody can be a journalist, including yours truly, a useful idiot. But that also is a mixed bag with fear-mongers. And you can either be a fear-monger, add to the din, add to the media distortions, or you can be a fact-checker. I prefer to be a fact-checker. Although I certainly have my biases, and I certainly am not above those predilections. I try to minimize them, and I hopefully achieve that on occasion. But needless to say, we all live our own lives, have had our own experiences, and have our own values, and they will come out in your work. So anyway, there's a great list of types of biases that we can look for, because, of course, political bias and media bias is not the only bias we're talking about here. So we also have commercial bias, the preference for new, exciting stories over less dramatic news. That's why we see one scandal replaced by another. And they throw mud on the wall and see if it sticks. They drag out a partisan witch hunt, see if they can get some legs on it. And if they can't, they just move on to the next one. And the media is all more than happy to comply because it makes their ratings go up. Then we have bad news bias. It's as simple as that. There's bad news sells. People don't want good news. People don't want happy news. They're drawn to the unusual, the bizarre, and the tragic. And then there's status quo bias. And that's when the underlying assumption that the system works and things are mostly okay. And that's the kind of media we have now. Why would anybody question media or corporations or banks or the government or foreign policy? Because the system works and everything's basically okay. Then we have access bias. And media, that's a real problem because they're co-opted. You have the Washington Press Corps in Washington, D.C., who are part of the government. They're part of the government propaganda apparatus. They are not journalists. And they tread lightly so as not to alienate their sources. Then there's visual bias, the preference for a story with a good picture. If they've got a good picture that sends a political message or an agenda message or a propaganda message, they will ride that picture and get all they can out of it. Then there's a narrative bias. And that's a preference for a story with a beginning, a middle, and end, because that's how people work. And they want a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the news will search out for that type of story. Makes things nice and tidy for them. And a nice antithesis to the usual barrage of sound bites. Then we have the so-called fairness bias, where they give all sides a hearing, but of course choose representatives that will discredit themselves by having really outlandish, crazy people on, or at least accusing somebody, that one of their guests, of being outlandish and crazy. And then what the main focus, of course, we're interested in is political bias, and that's pretty easy. And that leads in nicely to 5 things you can do to move yourself outside of the influence of media bias. Because especially when it comes to political bias, something we're all familiar with, it's pretty easy to figure out some ways to get away from that bias. And one of them is, if you're a conservative, don't watch Fox News. If you're liberal, don't watch MSNBC. But at the same time, if you're a conservative and you watch MSNBC, don't think it's a bunch of crazy horseshit dreamed up by crazy commie Muslim liberals. It's just the other herd. It's just the other group of sheeple in another herd, and they happen to believe this thing. So then you have Fox News, you have all the conservatives, and if a liberal watches Fox News, he knows he's going to hear all the stuff he doesn't want to hear, not realizing that's just another herd of a different species of sheeple. And they each have their own beliefs, and they just lambast each other without ever looking in the mirror and seeing that they merely reflect each other with just a different color. And so that's number one. Number one way to move away from liberal biases, or move away from bias in media, is to move away from the known outlets for that bias. And in fact, probably not a bad idea to move outside of your comfort zone. So anyway, let's get to number 2. Separate news from opinion. Just start training to look for what is fact and what is opinion. Once you start looking for it, it's pretty easy to spot because it's always out there. Editorials is easy to spot, and a lot of news programs, it's also easy to spot what is opinion. And remove that and look at the objective facts. And it's easier to focus in on what the truth is if you're not handed an opinion from somebody else and you make your own opinion. So, number 3, learn to spot the questionable. So there's a lot of sources, fact check, shadow stats, Snopes, all those sites where you can fact check certain things. But learn to spot the questionable. Learn to spot things that pose a question, something that's presented as a fact when it's actually something that is not a fact, and you have to question it. So if it is questionable in the true sense of the word, question it and look it up and find out more yourself. There's a lot of claims that are certainly exaggerated, distorted, or false are pretty easy to pick out in spite of one's own bias. Then number 4, which is a variation on something I already talked about, and that's getting balance. It's not a bad idea. Once again, as another YouTuber brought up, the idea of keeping tabs on what the kooks are doing and what the kooks are saying. And it's a good idea to balance out your news consumption with different sources with different sorts of biases. Because that way, at least, you'll get a balance. You get outside your comfort zone. You might open up to some new ideas, as abhorrent as that might sound right now. But more importantly, once you start watching both sources, say conservative and liberal media sources, you can ferret out quickly, like, what are the similarities? That's what's more important than the differences, is the similarities. And so recognizing that media bias and then reflecting back on your own thoughts and opinions is a good thing. And then number 5 is recognize your own bias. And I'm pretty I can be pretty judgmental and unrelenting on others, but I'm also pretty judgmental and unrelenting on myself. And I have no illusions, so I certainly recognize my biases, and it makes me all the more fierce in trying to overcome them and face them. And of course, the most important thing is being able to laugh at your own biases and your own fallacies. So that's the important thing. And so once you recognize your own biases, once again, it's easier to look at media and see how they play into your own personal biases. And remember, everyone is biased. We live in our own skin. We have our own lives. We have our own experiences. And that's just the way it is. And to have that be a sticking point and all Americans getting together to combat the real enemy, the state, on a global level, the state, and not partisan bickering and not politics as usual. We all need to go after the state, and seeing through media bias is an important step in that direction. And as my friend Bertley said, and then I woke up. So there you have it, a little guideline to media bias. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too. And remember, if I agreed with you, then we'd both be wrong.